This lecture is being brought to you in part by the generous gifts of these sponsors.
Hello. Such a huge pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming this evening. This is my standard disclosure slide. This is basically just a fancy way of saying all the stuff that Dr. Ford just said. And all of these different activities that I perform will hopefully inform most of the talk today. So, as many of you may know, the prevalence of dementia is increasing. You can see we're somewhere here, and the prevalence of dementia is expected to double or triple in the next few decades. Right now, globally, it's the 18th leading cause of death. It's projected to be the 6th leading cause of death in 2040, and in the US, it will be the second or top leading cause of death behind ischemic heart disease. So dementia, unfortunately, right now, is on the increase. When we then think about cognitive function before that point, throughout our entire lives, we can measure all these different parts of how our brain works, and you can see how they change on average over time. So up here, we have aspects of crystallized intelligence, or what you might call wisdom, and some of that actually increases or stays relatively stable. A lot of the things that we learned early in life, we remember those things for the rest of our lives. Emotional regulation, things like that, stay relatively stable. Certain things like spatial orientation, they actually peak slightly later, maybe in our 40s and 50s. And then down here, we see aspects of long-term and short-term memory, processing speed, so how fast things are actually going through the brain, and different aspects of reasoning. This is working memory. Unfortunately, all of those things tend to decrease, but essentially linearly after our 20s or 30s. Or so we think. So this then is how we think about our cognitive function. Here we have age on the bottom, we have cognitive function there on the y-axis, and we know it peaks early in life, so as the early years into your 20s, where our cognitive function improves, and then after that, it's this unstoppable decline that we can do nothing about, and maybe at some point we'll lose so much function that we experience dementia. And if we're going to do anything about this, we can only make it worse, right? When we get stressed, when we don't sleep well, when we drink too many cocktails or too many glasses of wine before a lecture. And this is what everybody thinks their brain function looks like. Unfortunately, this doesn't have to be the case. This is a quote taken from the Lancet Commission, which is a big, slightly dusty and formal group of academics, and even they say that it's never too late or too early in the life course to prevent dementia. They just updated their evidence. This came out this year, and you can see all these different factors and the different parts of the lives that they occur, and these things, we believe, if we were to address all of them, we could prevent at least 45% of dementia. So you can see early life education, then through midlife we have things like hearing loss, depression, traumatic brain injury, diabetes, smoking. Then we have later things like social isolation, visual loss, and some of these things are actually reversible, like we'll talk about. I actually think that this is a rather conservative estimate, because there are several things that we know are associated with dementia risk that they didn't include, like sleep, aspects of diet and nutrient status, as well as late life cognitive activity, which is what I'm going to talk about a lot today. So others actually suggest that maybe 50 to 70 or more % of dementia is preventable, and there was a big study that came out of the UK last year that suggested that. So there's actually a lot, hopefully, that we can do. This is a very nice figure from a colleague of mine, Professor Yin-Tai Yu, where they did a big analysis of hundreds of different studies looking at how these different factors can affect our risk of cognitive decline. So here is the risk on the side. Anything that's above the dotted line increases risk. Anything that is below the dotted line decreases risk. And you can see things like education, cognitive activity, decreasing risk, a healthy diet, physical activity, things you might expect. And then up here, sleep, Diabetes, high homocysteine, that's a marker of needing B vitamins, smoking, head trauma, alcohol here. So here already we're starting to see a big list of things that we can hopefully do to decrease our risk of cognitive decline. Now the problem is that immediately you can think that this is actually quite a long list and that it could be even longer than this. So this is a list that I took from a popular group on social media. This is their summary of Alzheimer's prevention. So you can see exercise, diet, smoking, all those things that we've talked about. And this is actually very evidence-based. So here's another study taken from The Lancet where they looked at, this is sort of the elevated risk, the relative risk. So this is a 60% increase if you have if you only have a primary school education. However, again, I think that there's more that we need to do here to kind of understand how these different pieces fit together. So we can say at this point that prevailing opinion does suggest that most dementia may be preventable. A large number of risk factors have been identified. But I think it's kind of unclear how we implement these on the individual level. And so far, we've assumed that all these relationships are linear. Like if you do all of these different things, then you'll get sort of like some stack of dementia prevention. But we know that this isn't the case. So we know that these different factors interact. So if you don't sleep well, you can overcome some of that with exercise. Or if you're exposed to air pollution, but you have good nutrient status, that can help protect you. So all these things interact. And so we need to build some kind of framework or hierarchy to understand all the different pieces of the puzzle. So this, I'm going to propose to you. I have a potential solution. It's not proven yet, but this is my idea that I'm going to talk about today. So it is the demand-driven theory of age-related cognitive decline and dementia, which has a catchy acronym. And if you really want to know kind of the idea, it's basically why your brain is like your biceps. And we're going to talk about that a bit today as well. So actually it does have a slightly better name now. I call it the 3S model. So 3 different interacting parts of factors that improve cognitive function and hopefully prevent cognitive decline. So they are stimulus, that's our physical activity, cognitive activity, social interaction. There's supply, so this is having a good, healthy cardiovascular system to get blood and oxygen and nutrients to the brain, and then having the necessary nutrients to support those processes. And then after we've stimulated the brain, we need to allow it time to adapt and recover. So this is where we need sleep. We need to avoid too much stress, which actually overstimulates the brain and prevents it from having an ability to recover and adapt. And then avoiding certain toxic exposures that can prevent some of these adaptations, so alcohol, air pollution, some of those things, smoking. And to kind of show you how this might work, we'll come back to the biceps. So this is how the 3S model works if you want to become more jacked. You have your stimulus, you go and you lift weights, and then you get more jacked. And you can see this with improved function, so that's improved strength, or with improved structure, so an increase in muscle mass. And hopefully, if you want to improve both your brain or your biceps, you want both. But of course, in order to get the most out of our stimulus, we need some supply of calories, protein, some micronutrients are important. And we also need to support the recovery process. Every bodybuilder knows that you don't get bigger in the gym, you get bigger when you recover afterwards, and the brain is essentially the same. So the main takeaway, though, is that if you don't have the stimulus, you don't get more jacked. And again, I think we see the same thing with the brain. So my colleague here, Dr. Josh Turknett, he actually came and spoke last year. I don't know if anybody was here, but a couple of years ago, we wrote a paper about this idea where we talked about how the function of the brain is driven by the stimulus that we put on it, and pretty much every tissue in the body is the same. The liver is the same, the immune system's the same. We've already talked about our biceps, our heart. The more stimulus we give to it, the better it adapts, the better function it has. And so you can see here, we talked about stimulus or cognitive demand really being the primary upstream driver of brain function. And when we stimulate the brain with things like education, music, exercise, we initiate this process of what we call demand-function coupling. So in response to a stimulus, and again, the muscles are the same, you start to activate all of these different processes involved in anti-aging, but also neuroplasticity. And then in order to benefit from that, you need the time to do that, which is when sleep and recovery occurs. However, unfortunately, when we think about cognitive function, when we think about dementia, we think about this end output here, which is aggregation of certain proteins in the brain, amyloid and tau. And these are related to these upstream functions, but really, this is where we want to focus. And this has become a little bit of a distraction, and maybe why focusing on those areas hasn't really given us much success yet. And this is critically important because unlike almost every other animal, the human brain is essentially designed to be shaped by its environment. There's a couple of very recent studies that show this very nicely. So if you look at the brain of a mouse versus a chimpanzee versus a human, you'll see an increase in these cortical folds that allows us to have greater space for more complex cognitive functions. An increase in this area here, which is the white matter, which is responsible for these really fast connections, as well as allowing us to have more complex cognitive processes. Then the areas of the brain associated with those cognitive processes are areas like the prefrontal cortex and the cerebellum. They have expanded as well. When we then look at how long it takes for the brain to fully develop in the human, that's essentially almost 30 years, or about nearly half the lifespan, which is much later into life relatively than those other animals. And the human, if we look at the speed of brain growth here, has the slowest growing brain of any species they've looked at. And this is because it wants to be informed by the environment so that it can then adapt and allow us to maximally perform in the niche that we exist in. When we see where this happens, almost all of the most recently evolved parts of the brain are also the parts of the brain that develop after we're born. And again, I think this is so that we can have our brain function be driven by the environment that we exist in. So here are some colored graphs, and essentially what they show is change over time. So this is going forwards in development, and then this is during aging. But you see anything that's hotter here in the top row. So here particularly we have the prefrontal cortex. Here we have the temporal lobe. These are the most recently evolved parts of the brain in the human. In the middle here, we see these are the areas of the brain that grow the most after birth. So these are the areas of the brain that are driven mostly by the environment. And they're essentially the same parts of the brain. And that's where we see here. Anywhere that's red shows that those two things are tightly correlated. So the most evolutionary recent parts of our brain are the parts of the brain that we actually use to adapt to the environment. Now, unfortunately, when we age, those same parts of the brain are most susceptible to the processes of aging. So we see the reverse here. Anything that's yellow is or red is something that declines or atrophies faster with the process of aging. So again, you see the same thing here with the prefrontal cortex, responsible for most of our complex decision-making, and then a bit the temporal lobe as well, involved in aspects of memory. And I'll posit now that one of the reasons for this is not that this is just a process of aging that we can't stop, although we can't stop aging entirely. It's because we remove the stimulus that drives the development of these parts of the brain as we get older. So here is an example of this. It's a complex graph, but this is something called a graphical network model. Essentially, we're looking at the relationship between all of these different things. If there's a line between them, that means they're statistically significantly connected. And then the color of the line tells us about the nature of the relationship. So if it's blue, then it's a negative correlation. If it's yellow or red, it's a positive correlation. And in here, we have cognition score. These are data from babies who are born extremely preterm. So that's before 28 weeks of gestation, basically 2/3 of the way through a normal pregnancy. And if you're born extremely preterm, you have an approximately 50% chance of either dying or suffering a severe neurodevelopmental impairment. When we looked at these data, this is from nearly 700 babies from a clinical trial that we ran at the University of Washington. We then wanted to see what factors determine or predict how these babies do at 2 years of age. And so we have this standardized cognitive function test, and we have a number of different things that happened to these babies. So we have whether they got severe sepsis or infections, we have how mature they were at birth, we have here, this is severe retinopathy of prematurity, so a severe eye condition. Here we have severe intraventricular hemorrhage, so this is a massive bleed in the brain. But the most important predictor of how these babies did at 2 years was their mother's education. More important than whether they had a huge bleed into the brain. And you see the same thing here. So this is the size of the effect, and you see maternal education has the biggest effect. So even in these babies who terrible things happen to them and they're born very early and they're at significant risk, the environment they go home to is the primary driver of how their brains do several years later. And of course, maternal education is a proxy for several things: nutrition, safety, stimulus, all these. So there's lots of things going on here, but this is essentially telling us about the environment the babies go home to, and that's much more important than anything that happened in hospital. Then fast forward to a group in their 60s. This is a very similar analysis we now did with nearly 1,000 people from sort of a representative US-based cohort. And we looked at cognitive function using something called the digit symbol substitution test, which is a measure of processing speed and a few other things. And you can see this is how it works here. So you get these empty boxes, you see these symbols here, and then you have to fill in these empty boxes as quickly as you can. There are 133, and you have 2 minutes to do it. So you have to do them at more than 1 a second if you want to get a perfect score. What we were interested in was different physical and training components and how they related to processing speed. The most important of those that we found was what we called relative force. So it's how strong were your legs relative to your overall body size. That was the best predictor. But the reason why I show this graph here is because much more important than that was the level of education of the individual. So again, the amount of stimulus that this brain has received early in life is a really important predictor of how that brain functions later in life. Now, part of this is because if you spend more time in education, you get better at doing tests. But some of this, I believe at least, is driven just by the learning environment and how that affects the brain. So people have studied this more widely than that. This is sort of a nice representative graph from a big meta-analysis that was done recently where they looked at the level of education and then people's cognitive trajectories over time. And they found that the more education somebody received early in life, the higher their peak of cognitive function. That doesn't necessarily change later decline, but if you start from a higher point and you have the same rate of decline, you'll reach a point of dementia much later, if you do ever reach it. Then we know that how we use our brains later in life can slow that trajectory of decline. So this is a meta-analysis of more than 100,000 people where they looked at cognitive stimulus from work. So how cognitively demanding is your job? And they said that the high level of stimulation was if you had a very cognitively stimulating job, but you had a lot of control over the work that you did. Because if you have a very stimulating job, but you don't have any control, then that's very stressful, and that sort of offsets some of the benefit. What was particularly interesting to me is that in those who had low early life education, but high cognitive stimulus, that essentially offset the negative effects of not having much education earlier in life. But having high levels of education and then high cognitive stimulus at work was associated with the lowest risk. But we can offset some of those early risks by increasing cognitive stimulus later in life. So then we've talked about how we can increase the peak of cognitive function and how you can maybe slow the rate of decline. Then there's a whole confluence of other factors and some of those things we talked about earlier, where this paper talks about how we can push out the period of time at which cognitive decline starts. So that's kind of what they're showing here. And now we start to see some of those same things we've talked about, food and diet, glycemic control. So this is basically whether you have prediabetes or diabetes, smoking, physical inactivity, sleep is important. So basically, with that combination of factors, we can increase cognitive function peak, we can slow decline, and we can push out the point at which that decline happens. So then this essentially is what that might look like. This is a very nice, one of my favorite papers published now 15 years ago, where they asked the question, can we enhance adult cognitive function? And they said, yes, we probably can. And it's interesting that each of us doesn't have this one fixed line of how our brains are destined to perform across our lifespan. We have this huge range that each of us could potentially inhabit if we choose to do certain things that could push us up towards the top of this line. So then these are how these different bits come together. So we turn to the 3S model. I think that stimulus is the primary driver, but we know that when you increase stimulus, then we have something called neurovascular coupling. The brain asks for more blood and oxygen, so that increases supply, and we respond to that with more blood flow and nutrients. And here are the different things that we can use to then support those processes, including sleep, trying to avoid stress, improving our physical health. And then together we improve brain structure and function, and then this then improves the things that we actually care about, our decision-making, preventing dementia. I will say that the things I have around the outside here, they're not mutually exclusive, so some of them hit multiple points. When I showed this diagram to a friend of mine, Dr. Julian Abel, who's an expert in how social interaction affects our brains, he's like, well, that fixes everything. Being socially connected is supply and stimulus and support, so it's all explained by social interaction. But there's certainly a lot of overlap in terms of how these different parts affect how our brain functions. So then we return to this idea and hopefully can appreciate that it's not this one fixed line. We can increase, with early interventions, we can increase our cognitive reserve earlier in life, but even if we start later, we can start to slow that decline by intervening with some of the things that we've talked about. So now I'll give you a little bit of my favorite evidence for the fact that the brain's function is driven by the way that we stimulate it. So we know that the responses are highly specific, and there are trade-offs. So if you want your brain to become really good at one thing, it's going to become slightly less good at something else. So imagine if you wanted to become a championship powerlifter and deadlift 1,000 pounds, you're not necessarily also going to be the world's best marathon runner. You have to kind of pick. We also know that broad cognitive stimuli have functional carryover. So if you stimulate your brain with complex cognitive tasks, usually things like music, complex sports, languages, they seem to then improve a wide range of other cognitive functions. And we also know that if we remove a stimulus, then we accelerate decline. So this is one of my favorite papers looking at the effect of cognitive stimulation. Some of you may have seen it before. This paper looked at individuals who were studying the knowledge, which back in the day when they didn't have Uber, if you wanted to drive a taxi in central London, you drove a black cab, and you had to learn the knowledge to be allowed to drive a black cab. The knowledge is memorizing a map of 25,000 streets, a 6-mile radius around Charing Cross Station. And when they then looked at individuals over time, they split people into 3 groups. So they had those who studied for the test, and this takes 3 years to study for the test, study for the test and passed, study for the test and failed, and then they had a control group. What they saw was that those who studied for the test and passed had an increase or improvement in structure of a certain part of the brain in the hippocampus, which is associated with this kind of visual memory. Now, what's interesting is that they also did another test, which is the Taylor complex figure test that you see on the right-hand side. This, you basically have to memorize this figure and then 30 minutes later draw out as much of it as you possibly can. And when those who passed the test, they got much better at obviously orienting themselves in space so they could navigate the map on the left, but they got worse at doing this kind of test on the right because they channeled so much energy from their brain into learning this one specific type of task. They then got less good at other types of tasks. So this is that exact trade-off. If we want to become really good at one thing, then we might become less good at something else, but that's the stimulus-specific aspect of the brain. I think that shows that very nicely. We then see similar things with other tasks. So this is a nice study where they taught people how to juggle. And what they then saw was as they learned how to juggle, they could see changes on an MRI scan in this part back here. This is the visual cortex. And actually, you might not realize it, but juggling is much more of a visual stimulus than a motor stimulus, because actually the hand movements are quite minimal, and you're stimulating your vision much more. And so what they saw is that after they learned how to juggle, they saw a change in structure of that part of the brain. And then when they stopped juggling, those changes started to recede. So we see a change in response to demand, and then we remove that demand or stimulus, then the changes start to go back. Just like if we stop going to the gym, our biceps get smaller. And this is exactly the same process. I also mentioned that if we do sort of more complex multi-component learning, then we see some carryover to other types of cognitive functions. So these are actually small pilot studies. They're now doing large sort of randomized controlled trials, but they took adults in their 60s and 70s, and they got to choose to learn some different tasks. So they could pick 3 or 4 of learning Spanish, learning photography, learning how to use an iPad, drawing and music composition. And then what they saw in 2 different cohorts is essentially that over time, as they did these things, their cognitive function more broadly, their executive function improved, like completely unrelated, which is a function, or it's a test completely unrelated to the tasks that they were learning. This shows something similar, but now in tasks that we're already good at. So this study took expert and amateur pianists who were young and old. And what they did is they did 2 different types of tests. So they had the general processing speed test, and this is actually the same digit symbol substitution test I told you about earlier. And then they had specific piano-related skill tests. What they found was that those who were younger performed better on the digit symbol substitution than those who were older. But when they looked at piano-specific skills, the older experts and the young experts actually performed just as well as each other. And the thing that best predicted how well they performed was how much time they'd spent practicing. So age had nothing to do with their skill level, and it all had to do with how much time they actually spent practicing that skill. So then we can start to think about these different aspects of cognitive function, these different networks in the brain that drive those different functions, and then we can think about ways that we could stimulate them with different activities. So this is a nice review paper that kind of showed that, and here we have these different networks within the brain associated with different functions, and then if we want to try and prevent the decline of those or increase the function of those, we can think about things like physical activity for the white matter. We can think about different kinds of cognitive stimulation for, this is the dorsal attention network, this is the frontoparietal network. But these different networks of the brain and how they speak to each other, we can directly stimulate those with different cognitive functions or with cognitive training. Speaking of the white matter, this is a table from a paper that we just recently published looking at the effects of resistance training, so lifting weights, on the structure of the brain and how that is associated with improvements in cognitive function. And what we see particularly is that resistance training is protective for the white matter. I talked about those parts of the brain that are responsible for complex cognitive functions and fast connections to the brain. The white matter seems to really benefit from resistance training compared to the gray matter on the outside and things like the hippocampus, which really seem to benefit from more like aerobic training, like running and cycling. And there seems to be a dose response. So if we want to see significant changes in the structure of the brain, something like 2 sessions a week for 6 months seems to be like the minimum effective dose. And then, this doesn't project that well, but this is one of my favorite papers of all time. This was buried in the supplemental material of a different paper, but they looked at, it was about 250,000 people, and they looked at the size of their biceps and their risk of dementia, and essentially the bigger the biceps, the lower the risk of dementia. And there was no upper limit, although, diminishing returns down here. We also know that stimulus is really important for the recovering brain. So these are graphs taken from a systematic review that a medical student in my lab, Master Key Rhodes, did, has recently submitted it for publication. But we looked at different interventions for individuals who still had symptoms more than a month after suffering from a traumatic brain injury, and those interventions compared to either standard physical therapy or rest, which was, at least at the time, was recommended for some people. But we know actually that one of the fastest ways to recover from some kind of brain trauma is some aspects of physical activity. And we found that aerobic exercise, Tai Chi, and then different augmented or virtual reality type interventions seem to have an additional benefit above sort of standard of care, or at least was very promising. So these new stimuli, even important for the brain that's recovering from some kind of injury. We also know that the stimulus doesn't necessarily have to be active. This is a super interesting study that was published last year. One of the authors was interviewed on STEM Talk recently, where they looked at individuals in their 60s to 80s, and for 6 months they had them smell a different essential oil during sleep. So they had 7, a different one for each day of the week, and they would rotate through them. And then they looked at how they performed on a memory task, so you can see that on the left here, and how a certain part of the brain, its structure on an MRI scan, and so they had a control group, who you see in blue, who got worse on both, whereas those who were exposed to the smells while they slept improved on both. So multiple different kinds of stimuli seem to be improving our cognitive function. The final part of the stimulus story ties into something that we see in individuals who have cognitive impairment and then Alzheimer's disease, which is how much glucose, how much energy can get into their brains. So you can do something called a PET scan. Some of you might have seen a scan like this. And so this is looking at how much glucose can get into the brain. So this is a normal individual. You can see it sort of red around the cortex. Then that decreases slightly in those who have mild cognitive impairment or mild memory issues, and then decreases again in those with Alzheimer's disease. And we've always thought that as part of this disease process, the glucose just can't get in. So you're not getting the energy to the parts of the brain that you need it. But what's interesting is that when you're looking at how much glucose is getting into the brain, that doesn't tell you whether it's that it can't get in or that it's not being used. And when you look at that question, you actually see that it might be driven by how you're using your brain. This study is now over 20 years old, and what they did was they looked at how much glucose uptake to the brain changes when the brain is stimulated with a complex cognitive task. And so here you can see Alzheimer's individuals who are kind of severe, moderate, or mild. This box plot here, this is the range for normal controls. And at least in moderate stages of the disease, the brain responds just fine to stimulus. The glucose can get in, you just need to use the brain in order for it to ask for that glucose in the first place. So in this study, what they said was that during cognitive stimulation, regional glucose uptake and blood flow can increase approximately to the same extent as in mildly demented Alzheimer's disease patients as in controls. So therapies at this stage should be designed to re-establish synaptic integrity. So I said we should be increasing demand, and actually the brain can respond. It's not just this fixed thing where the glucose can't get in. On the other side of it, like I mentioned earlier, we know that losing inputs to the brain can accelerate our cognitive decline. So one example of this is losing a sense. We know that those who lose their smell, their vision, their hearing are at an increased risk of cognitive decline, and that's reversible. So if you have hearing loss and you get a hearing aid, or if you have cataracts and you get cataract surgery, you can offset some of that risk. So this is a study that was recently done, not by me, but at the University of Washington, where they looked at individuals with cataracts and looked at their risk of dementia after cataract surgery. And you see that those who had cataract surgery had a significantly decreased risk of dementia. And I like this plot because they compare it to the benefit that you get from having an additional 4 years of education. So it's on that same order of magnitude. We also know that the degree of social engagement, our social interaction, our social support is associated with our dementia risk. And then similarly related to cognitive stimulus at work, how we use our brains at work is one of the most important ways that we stimulate our brains. And when we retire, that is actually the point at which we see the most rapid rate of cognitive decline. Unless you come to talks like this. What's interesting, again, related to that social isolation piece, is that they've done studies looking at how brains change in response to social isolation. So in prisoners who are put in solitary confinement, for example. And what you see is that the areas of the brain that change or atrophy in response to social isolation, so again, here we see the prefrontal cortex again, here we see the temporal lobe. So the highlighted areas are the areas that are affected by social isolation. Those are the same areas that start to recede in Alzheimer's disease. So again, like the redder or the hotter, the faster the decline in Alzheimer's disease patients. So the areas of the brain that are stimulated by social interaction, those are the areas of the brain where if we remove that social interaction, we start to see accelerated decline. So if we then go back to this graph and this paper, when they talked about the requirements of cognitive enrichment, these are the things we need, or the brain needs, in order to maximally perform. They talked about three things. So they had the functioning, or enhancing the functioning of the neural substrate. And these are some of the things that people talk about, nutrition, physical activity. We've talked about that here today. But then they said the next two things were the level of cognition itself. So this is how we use our brains. And the larger context in which an individual thinks, learns, and remembers. So this is how we use our brains out in the world, use those things that we've learned. So two of the three things they mentioned are how the brain is used. And they said these are the most important factors for long-term cognitive function. So if we then think about again, this trajectory of cognitive function across the lifespan, we can think about, well, how do we use our brains across the lifespan? So I've made this graph. Anybody who came to my talk here 4 years ago may recognize this, but we, across the bottom, we'll have these different stages of our life, and on the y-axis, on the side here, I have what I've called arbitrary nervous system demand. So how much are you stimulating your brain? So early in life, we know that we have to learn to walk, we have to learn to talk, we have to learn social interaction. This is maximally stimulating. This is the hardest thing that your brain can ever do, and this is what drives our initial brain development. Then, where we become teenagers and we learn how to drive, and learning how to drive is difficult, but it's not as hard as learning how to walk in the first place. Maybe we go to medical school and we learn to biochemistry, and we learn the Krebs cycle, and that's hard and a bit boring, but it's not as hard as learning how to talk. And then, we go to work and we do the same thing again and again and again and again and again every day. And sometimes that's good. Like, I want my surgeon to do the same thing every day so that she's really good at the surgery. But unfortunately, that means that the brain isn't being stimulated in the same way. Then, as we talked about, when we retire, we lose even the cognitive stimulus that we get from work. So we think, well, I have to use my brain, so I'll do some Sudoku. And maybe we get a little bump here, but only a small one. So then if we plot this graph over the top, we see that the decline, our function sort of declines along with how we use our brains out in the world. And so I would argue that this is not necessarily driven just by aging, it's actually driven by the way that we use our brains, and it's responding appropriately. So then you might ask, well, do we have any evidence that these things might be the case? I think this is the nicest, or one of the nicest examples that we have so far. This is the finger trial, now run more than 10 years ago in Finland, where they took older adults who were at risk of cognitive decline, and they had them do multiple things at the same time, or there was a control group. But the group who had the intervention, they had some improvements in diet, They had a strength and aerobic training program. They did some cognitive training. And then they had some vascular risk monitoring. We talked about the importance of having a healthy cardiovascular system. And then what they saw was that the intervention group, they improved more with processing speed, and we talked about that test earlier, and executive function than the control group. It is important to have a control group because, unfortunately, with a lot of cognitive function tests, you just get better at the test rather than actually having improved anything in terms of your brain health. But you see significantly better improvement in those who had multiple things going on at the same time. So this multi-pronged intervention seemed to kind of show that this stuff was possible. And actually, what's interesting is that even on a population scale, we seem to be seeing some benefit here. So I told you that Alzheimer's disease incidence and dementia incidence is increasing. But actually, over the past 2 or 3 decades, the age-specific incidence of Alzheimer's has been decreasing. So at any given age, you're now less likely to get it, but the prevalence is increasing just because we're living longer. So what you see is that for all-cause dementia, Alzheimer's disease, there's been around a 15% decrease per decade in the age-specific incidence of Alzheimer's disease. And actually the benefit, unfortunately, has been greater in men than in women. And I say unfortunately because more women are affected by Alzheimer's disease than men. And the reason they think that this is because most of this seems to be driven by improvements in cardiovascular disease health, and that's more prevalent in men. So with these big population efforts to decrease heart disease, we've actually been helping the brain at the same time, but that still leaves a lot of work to do because it's preferentially seems to have benefited men. So this then brings us to some of the work that we're kind of doing at the forefronts of this to better understand some of these risk factors and how we can intervene and who we should intervene in. We mentioned at the beginning that I'm working for this charity in the UK called Food for the Brain. Several years ago, they instituted a free fully validated cognitive function test. It was the first online fully validated cognitive function test that was available freely online. It's now been done by nearly 500,000 people. And recently we added a 144-item lifestyle questionnaire. So everything about diet, sleep, physical activity, cognitive activity. So about 25,000 people have now answered both. So one of the things that we're trying to think about is, can we generate a sort of a lifestyle score for cognitive function? Because most scores that are out there based on lifestyle, they basically, the investigators who made them have kind of said, well, we like these things, so we're going to make these things into a score. Whereas we now have lots of data, we can kind of generate a score from those data that at least is sort of better connected to something. So this is an example of it. It's something that we're working on right now. But to do this, we used a very simple machine learning algorithm called a lasso, so to basically pick the most important questions and say, how much does this answer to this question associated with cognitive function? And then we can develop it in one group of individuals and validate it in another. And just with our lifestyle questions, we can predict about 25% of somebody's cognitive function. And these are the most important questions that we've seen so far. And again, some of the same things pop up again and again. So here we have those who don't smoke. They have higher cognitive function. Those who read or play games every day, they have higher cognitive function. Those who always use alcohol or medications to sleep or have hearing loss, they have lower cognitive function. There are some interesting things that we still need to understand better. So that the most predictive question was not supplementing with antioxidants. That had the biggest negative effect. Now, of course, different people take supplements versus those who don't, so it might not be that everybody needs to go out and take an antioxidant supplement, but I think there's a huge amount of information that we can gain from these kinds of data. In a follow-up study to that one I showed you earlier in older adults looking at that digit symbol substitution test, the processing speed, we've now asked a later cohort of data. This is again sort of an average population here in the US, looking at what are some of the modifiable factors where we could potentially intervene to improve processing speed. Again, so the way this plot works is that the color of the dot tells you about the value. So purple is a high value for that, yellow is low. And then where it exists on this plot tells you about whether it's associated with an increase in cognitive function or a decrease. And so, as you might expect, education was again our best predictor. So those with the highest level of education, they had the highest cognitive function. Age was important, sex was important. Women always do better on this test. And then other aspects like income and poverty, that plays a role here. But then we can get into some of the stuff that we can maybe act upon. So grip strength was our most important modifiable factor. Now, this may be, the benefits of going to the gym and doing those bicep curls, but of course we also know that the strength in our hands tells us something about how we interact with the world. So grip strength probably tells us about many things at the same time. Then we can look at things like hemoglobin. We know that iron status is really important, making sure we don't have blood pressure that's too high. This level here is met, so this is an estimate of how much physical activity people do. So the higher their physical activity, the higher their cognitive function. Vitamin D, folate. At the bottom here, we have methylmalonic acid. This is a measure of how much B12 we need. So B vitamins, vitamin D, physical activity, all these things are things that we can potentially act upon to improve sort of like the basic functions of our brain. Then sort of the last piece of work we're doing is trying to figure out how we might understand interventions over shorter periods of time. So this is part of a big collaborative group. You see my good friend Chantal Pratt at the top right there, Andy Galpin, Paulie de Toro, individuals with expertise in military space, in sports performance. Chantal is an expert in cognitive function. And the reason why we've kind of come together is because if we want to do big studies of things that might prevent dementia or slow cognitive decline, if we were just going to do that by doing repeat cognitive function tests and try each intervention one at a time, we're never going to be able to figure it out. It's going to take too long, it's going to be too hard, it's going to be too expensive. So we're thinking about what are the ways that we can track the health of the brain in a much faster and sort of agile way so that we can see, is this intervention working over a shorter period of time? The way we're starting to do that is we assume that if we have some marker that tells us something about the health of the brain, then this should also be related to more proximal issues like fatigue or readiness, which are very important in the military, very important for the athletes that I work with. So we have this idea that there should be something or some things that we can measure that tell us about the state of the brain, and that they tell us about the brain right now, but also over time in the same individual, they can tell us about how the brain is changing. And then we can use that to track how people respond to an intervention, and then see what we need to do for each given individual. So what this might look like is we'll do lots of different measurements. We'll measure the electrical activity of the brain with EEG. We'll measure how well the neurons fire to the rest of the body. That's ENG, electroneurography. We'll look at how their eyes move because the eyes are an extension of the brain that tells us a lot. ERP's event-related potential. So if we expose you to a visual or an auditory stimulus, we see how long it takes your brain to process that. And then even some things like subjective questionnaires, like how you feel about yourself and your cognitive function, which could be sort of like the ultimate integrated answer of how your brain thinks it's doing, is going to be important as well. We know that certain things or parts of these already predict cognitive function. So there's Chantal has lots of data showing that baseline, your EEG, tells you something about how you perform on a standard cognitive function test. But we can build sort of these different types of data to see like how is your brain doing right now, and then we can see well what happens if you're sleep deprived, what happens if you're physically stressed, and then how can we mitigate that with addressing nutrient status or something like that. So this then brings us to like the final part. I think there are still a lot of open questions that I'm very excited to work on with that group as well as people here at IHMC. So I think there's still, though I'm a big believer in it, I've talked to you about it for 50 minutes, I think we really need to know like how much does demand-function coupling drive cognitive function in humans. We have lots of evidence from animals. We have all that observational evidence from humans that I talked about, but still we'd like to see that in practice. Then we'd like to know, well, what's the best way to train or use our brains so that we can like give people recommendations. Like I mentioned, there are lots of studies where you just get better at the test, but that's not what people really care about. And some of the most exciting interventions seem to be certain aspects of virtual reality, Open skill sports is a fancy way of saying a sport that you have to like respond or react to the environment. So ball sports, somebody was talking about pickleball earlier, that's a great open skill sport. Badminton, table tennis, soccer, anything like that where you're having to react to the environment or other people. Languages, music, those seem to have similar effects. Then we need to know, well, what conditions are necessary for the brain to respond to that kind of stimulus. So then those are those different aspects of physical health, sleep, nutrient status. And then can we track this over time and build these big comprehensive models of how the brain works so that we know what we should do and who we should do it for. And I think that this is really critically important because so far we have, other than a couple of controversial recent therapies, we've basically failed to generate any kind of drugs for Alzheimer's disease or dementia. And I think what we've really focused on is targeting some of those pathologies in the brain that I talked about earlier, but not talking about what the brain needs in order to improve when we remove some of that pathology. So you can imagine maybe some of the drugs that have failed previously have failed because we've taken out something that's causing some negative effect in the brain, but we've never given the brain a reason to improve and respond now that that's been removed. But it's certainly possible that both of those things would be important at the same time. What I think is particularly interesting is that, we talked a lot about why the brain is a lot like our muscles, but we know so much about what we can do with our muscles, the different ways that we can train them and how they'll respond. And we know much less about the brain in terms of that. So like, how do we even quantify the amount of work that your brain is doing? We don't know that. How do you track improvements over time? These are things that we can do with physical activity, but are very hard with cognitive activity, and that's hopefully something that we can address in the near future. And I think that there's certainly some promise that people are moving in this direction. We go back to that Lancet Commission report I talked about right at the beginning. This is the most recent one. And these are all the factors that we talked about there. And then they sort of group them, and then these are the different aspects of the brain that they're improving. So improving the vasculature, the blood vessels, reducing stress and inflammation, building cognitive reserve. And actually now pathology is kind of grouped in with all these other things that are happening at the same time. They're not focusing purely on pathology like they have done in the past. So I think people are slowly coming around to these kinds of ideas. And then hopefully we'll end up with something that looks like this, or maybe even more complicated, where we can start to build all these different parts and actually model how these different aspects of our environment and our physical and health and other lifestyle factors, and how they then affect some of these measurable things like our vascular health, our metabolic health, our hormones, and then how that then affects the brain. And a lot of these things are based on how we stimulate the brain, but not necessarily all of them. So all of these things come together, and hopefully one day we'll have a way of actually putting numbers and really understanding how these bits fit together. So in summary, hopefully I've convinced you that the majority of dementia may be preventable, but the brain function and health is primarily driven by cognitive stimulus, like how we use our brains, and then that's supported by a whole host of other lifestyle-related factors. Luckily, your brain has some control over its own destiny. It's not just going to sit there in your head and slowly get worse over time. We actually have some ways that we can intervene. And if you're going to take away one thing that you should do after this talk, go and learn a new complex skill, hopefully with a friend. Thank you very much for your time. Yeah. Oh, I have to point. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. It was very fascinating. I just had a question in terms of, and I know you mentioned on the last slide, so we got to the hormone aspect of it, but I'm just wondering like what you're seeing in trends in terms of all of these things coming together as hormones are declining, right? So especially, I'll be the example, perimenopause, right? So your hormones are declining, so there's less natural ability to, like I train a lot, right? And then you start to notice your training is, these things that help start to decline based on the body declining. And then you see it men as well, right? And I was just wondering, with those being such there's, I mean, so many hormones that factor into this, right? But I'll just take the basic, the sex hormones, essentially. Is there more and more research now on that and how that affects cognition? Because it also, I always think about the heart disease aspect too, right? So if your sex hormones are going down, there's these cascade of events that, chicken before the egg kind of thing. Which one is it? Is it that cascade that then affects the heart condition, or is it the actual heart condition?
Yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts there, as you might imagine. I think if you look at the perimenopausal and the menopausal period, there certainly does seem to be the hormones and how they change in that period is definitely related to changes in cognition in women, and that's probably one of the reasons why they have a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease, though it's also partly because men just die of something else earlier, and usually heart disease. So there haven't been any really good trials, but it does seem that if you intervene early, you can offset some of those effects with some kind of well-managed bioidentical hormone replacement therapy. Part of what you see, though, is related to just the trajectory of aging. So if you sort of like plot things over time, it's not like there's this sudden drop-off during menopause. Part of what happens, I think, is that as we get older, and this is relevant to men too, is we expect that we can do less, so we do less, and then our body responds. So part of it is just understanding that we actually have control, and some of it, the hormones do absolutely play a role. And so say testosterone in men, a lot of what drives decreases in testosterone in men over time is other aspects of physical health. So if you have a poor diet and you're sedentary and you're not sleeping, and then you just take testosterone because your testosterone is low, you've not fixed the underlying problems, and you might not see some of the benefit. So some of that can be helpful, but you have to make sure that you're addressing some of the other factors that may be driving it as well.
Thank you. It was an excellent lecture. Since we know that sleep is so important, particularly with aging, and it seems that so many seniors, as they get older, have more trouble sleeping and turn to sleeping medication, which is detrimental.
Yeah.
So what is your solution there? What's the important solution?
So so the first point is very important, that it seems that if you're relying on medication to sleep, that may increase the risk of cognitive decline, especially certain medications like antihistamines, Benadryl, Nitol, that kind of stuff. There are some medications that don't seem to negatively affect sleep architecture. So if you do need medications to sleep, something like trazodone seems to be better. Although if you can avoid those things, that would be ideal. Some things that are really important to improve sleep drive and sleep quality include physical activity. So exercise is one of the best ways to improve sleep quality. And then what's very interesting is that when you look at areas of the brain that were stimulated during the day, and that's generally been tested with like a physical or motor stimulus, but those areas of the brain have a greater sleep pressure as well. So the way to get your brain to sleep better is to use your brain more and exercise more. That's not going to fix everything. So sometimes things like melatonin and some other aspects can be important as well. But I think that physical activity and then a cognitive stimulus does seem to then drive greater sleep need and better sleep later that night.
Time for one more question.
I think you've had your hand up for a while.
I feel like we've done about 500 mental push-ups. And it makes me think I think it's going to hold off cognitive decline in my brain until at least Christmas.
Great.
And I would recommend as a treatment maybe recurring viewings of your slideshow. And I want to comment that you seem to take your own research seriously with the big muscles you have and all the degrees.
Yeah. My wife says that I'm not allowed any more degrees, unfortunately. So I just have to do more push-ups instead.
And I remember your talk from 4 years ago, and remember that slide comparing talking and the demands of learning to talk from the things in retirement. But one the thing I wanted to say on a serious level was, I think you're aiming very high. It's very creative work. I think you need to continue. Just go for it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.